Rain pattered softly against the windshield of the patrol car as two officers sipped their coffee, trying to stay alert during their night shift. The dashboard clock showed 10:30 p.m., and the streets of downtown were gradually emptying out. Street lights cast long shadows across the wet pavement, creating a peaceful yet eerie atmosphere. Officer Lee, a 12-year veteran of the force, glanced at his partner, Officer Wilson, who was fresh out of the academy just 8 months ago. They'd been paired together for the past 3 months, and despite their age difference, they developed an easy friendship built on mutual respect and a shared dedication to their work. "Quiet night," Wilson said, breaking the comfortable silence. He adjusted the temperature control, trying to fight off the autumn chill that had settled into the city. The coffee in their cups had gone lukewarm, but they drank it anyway, knowing they needed to stay sharp for the remaining 6 hours of their shift. Lee nodded, his experienced eyes constantly scanning their surroundings as they cruised past closed shops and late-night diners. He'd seen enough in his career to know that the quietest nights could turn dramatic in an instant. "Sometimes quiet is good," he replied, thinking back to some of the more challenging shifts he'd faced over the years. Their radio crackled occasionally with routine updates from dispatch. A noise complaint in the residential district, a false alarm at a convenience store, and a couple of drunk college students being rowdy outside a pizza place. Nothing out of the ordinary for a Wednesday night. Wilson was learning the rhythm of night patrol, understanding that it was different from the daytime shifts he trained in. The darkness changed everything. The way they approached situations, how they needed to be more alert to their surroundings, and how even simple traffic stops required extra caution. They pulled into a gas station for a quick break, and Wilson grabbed them fresh coffees while Lee stretched his legs. The fluorescent lights of the convenience store cast a harsh glow across the empty parking lot. Inside, the tired-looking cashier gave them a friendly wave. He was used to seeing officers during these late hours. Back in the car, they discussed their families and weekend plans, the kind of casual conversation that helped keep them alert during the long nights. Lee talked about his kids' upcoming school play, while Wilson shared stories about his attempts to train his new puppy. It was these moments of normalcy that helped balance out the unpredictable nature of their job. As they turned onto Main Street, they noticed the traffic had picked up slightly. The bars would be closing in a few hours, which usually meant their night was about to get busier. They'd already handled several minor violations earlier: a broken taillight, an expired registration, and a driver who'd rolled through a stop sign. The city took on a different character at night. The usual bustle of business people and shoppers was replaced by delivery trucks, late-night workers, and the occasional group of partygoers. Every shadow and sudden movement caught their attention, their training keeping them ready for anything. Neither officer could have predicted that in just a few minutes, their routine night would take an unexpected turn. As they approached the intersection of Fifth and Park, they had no idea they were about to become part of a story that would make headlines across the country. But for now, they were just two cops doing their job, protecting their city while most of its residents slept soundly in their beds. The dashboard computer beeped softly, reminding them to complete their hourly location check-in. Wilson radioed dispatch with their position, his voice clear and professional. They were about to discover that sometimes the most extraordinary nights start out looking just like any other. The night shifted from quiet to intense in a matter of seconds. Just as Officer Lee was reaching for his radio to call in a routine check, a black SUV with government plates zoomed through the red light, nearly clipping a taxi. Both officers straightened in their seats, training kicking in as they exchanged a quick glance. "Did you see that?" Wilson asked, already reaching for the lights and sirens. Lee nodded, smoothly pulling their patrol car into the right lane and accelerating. The SUV was moving fast, weaving slightly between lanes in a way that immediately raised red flags for both officers. The chase wasn't dramatic, no screeching tires or dangerous speeds, but something felt off. The SUV's tinted windows were darker than legally allowed, and despite the government plates, its movement suggested the driver might be impaired. For 3 blocks, the vehicle continued forward, ignoring their lights and sirens. "Dispatch, we're in pursuit of a black government-issued SUV, heading north on Park Avenue," Wilson radioed, his voice steady despite the adrenaline starting to pump through his system. He read out the plate number, keeping his eyes fixed on the vehicle ahead. The response from dispatch confirmed the vehicle was registered to a government motor pool. Finally, after what felt like much longer than it actually was, the SUV's right turn signal clicked on. The vehicle pulled over, but not before taking a wide turn that had it mounting the curb slightly before settling into position. Both officers noticed how the brake lights flickered several times, as if the driver was uncertain about the pedals. "Remember protocol," Lee said quietly to his partner as they prepared to approach the vehicle. "Government plates or not, we treat this like any other stop." Wilson nodded, double-checking that his body camera was active. These days, documentation was everything, especially when dealing with potentially high-profile situations. The street was quiet now, their red and blue lights painting the wet pavement in alternating colors. A few late-night pedestrians had stopped to watch from a safe distance, phones already out and recording. The officers could see movement behind the SUV's tinted windows, but couldn't make out clear shapes or faces. As they approached, they split up according to standard procedure, Lee taking the driver's side, Wilson covering the passenger side. Their flashlights cut through the darkness, illuminating the vehicle's pristine black paint and chrome trim. This wasn't your average government fleet vehicle. This was something special. The driver's window didn't roll down immediately. Lee had to tap on it twice with his flashlight, each tap echoing in the quiet street. When it finally started to lower, the glass moved in jerky increments, as if someone was struggling with the controls. The back window began to lower as well, catching Wilson's attention. The interior smell that wafted out was distinctive. Expensive leather mixed with something else, something that made both officers' instincts kick into high alert. Years of experience told them this wasn't going to be a routine traffic stop, even before they saw who was sitting in the back seat. "License and registration," Lee said firmly, keeping his tone professional despite the growing tension. The driver, dressed in a dark suit, seemed frozen, his hands gripping the steering wheel at perfect 10 and 2 positions. But it was the movement from the back seat that drew their attention. Someone important was about to make themselves known. The night air had grown colder, and a light drizzle had started again, creating halos around the streetlights. More cars were slowing down as they passed, curious onlookers wondering what could make a government vehicle get pulled over. Neither officer could have guessed that within hours, this stop would be the top story on every news channel in the country. "Do you have any idea who I am?" a voice from the back seat demanded, setting in motion a chain of events that would test both officers' dedication to their oath of serving justice equally to all. The voice from the back seat belonged to a man in an expensive suit, his silver hair perfectly styled despite the late hour. As he leaned forward into the beam of Officer Lee's flashlight, both officers immediately recognized him. The chairman of the Intelligence Committee, one of the most powerful senators in the country. "I don't care who you think you are," Officer Lee replied calmly, his voice steady despite the growing tension. "You ran a red light, and we need to see some identification." He could smell alcohol drifting from the open window, strong enough to confirm his suspicions about impaired driving. The senator's face turned red with anger. "Do you realize I'm coming from a classified briefing? I could have you both cleaning traffic cones for the rest of your careers." His words were slightly slurred, and he fumbled with his wallet as he tried to pull out his government ID. Officer Wilson maintained his position on the passenger side, watching as more cars slowed down to observe the scene. Someone had apparently recognized the senator. Phones were out, recording everything. The officer knew this situation could explode in their faces if they didn't handle it perfectly. The driver, clearly the senator's security detail, looked increasingly uncomfortable. Sweat beaded on his forehead, despite the cool night air. He handed over his license and registration with trembling hands, avoiding eye contact with both officers. "Sir, I'm going to need you to step out of the vehicle, Lee said to the senator, his tone professional but firm. This was the moment of truth, the point where these stops usually either calmed down or escalated dramatically. The senator's response was immediate and loud. Absolutely not. Do you know how many state secrets I'm carrying? I'm calling the chief right now. He pulled out his phone, fingers jabbing at the screen with clumsy movements that only confirmed the officer's suspicions about his state. Officer Wilson noticed news vans pulling up at both ends of the street. Somehow, word had gotten out about who they'd stopped. The blue and red lights from their patrol car continued to flash, creating an almost theatrical scene for the growing audience. Sir, Lee tried again. This is the standard procedure. Your position doesn't change the law. We can do this quietly and professionally, or... He let the sentence hang, giving the senator a chance to reconsider his approach. Instead, the senator started making calls. Get me the police commissioner. He barked into his phone. No, I don't care what time it is. Wake him up. His voice carried across the street, where a small crowd had gathered, their phone cameras capturing every moment. The security detail driver looked like he wanted to disappear into his seat. Sir, he said quietly to the senator, maybe we should cooperate. The look the senator gave him could have frozen water. Both officers stood their ground, despite the growing circus around them. They could hear sirens in the distance, probably senior officers responding to the senator's calls. But they also knew their body cameras were recording everything, and they were following procedure to the letter. The senator's demeanor suddenly shifted, moving from rage to something more calculating. Look, officers, he said, his voice now honey-smooth despite the slight slur. Let's be reasonable here. I'm sure we can work something out that benefits everyone. Your precinct could probably use some extra funding. Officer Wilson felt his stomach turn at the implied bribe, while Lee maintained his professional demeanor. Sir, please step out of the vehicle now. The words were simple, but carried the weight of years of training and dedication to doing what's right. The crowd had grown larger, and the first news crews were setting up their cameras. The night had transformed from a routine patrol into something that would test not just these officers' professional integrity, but the very notion that no one is above the law. The senator reached for the door handle, and both officers tensed, knowing the next few moments would define not just this night, but possibly their entire careers. Officer Lee's mind raced as he watched the senator struggle with the door handle. Every training session, every lesson about ethical decision-making, every conversation about integrity. It all came down to this moment. The weight of his badge felt especially heavy tonight. Rain started falling harder now, drops glistening in the patrol car's flashing lights. The growing crowd held their phones steady, recording everything despite the weather. News reporters spoke urgently into their microphones, describing the scene as it unfolded. The senator finally got the door open, but instead of stepping out, he remained seated, 1 foot on the wet pavement. Last chance, officers, he said, his voice dropping to a whisper that only they could hear. I sit on the committee that controls your department's federal funding. Think very carefully about your next move. Officer Wilson watched his partner closely, ready to back whatever decision he made. They discussed situations like this during quiet moments in the patrol car, how they'd handle stopping someone powerful, someone who could actually affect their careers. But talking about it was one thing, living it was another. 3 police cruisers pulled up, their lights adding to the chaos of colors bouncing off the wet street. A lieutenant stepped out of one, already talking on his phone as he approached. The senator's face showed the first hint of a smile, probably thinking help had arrived. Officers, the lieutenant called out, what's the situation here? His tone was neutral, professional, giving nothing away about which way this might go. Both officers straightened their backs, ready to explain their actions. Lee spoke first, his voice clear and steady. Sir, we observed this vehicle run a red light. Upon approaching, we detected signs of possible impairment. we're proceeding with standard protocol. Simple facts, nothing more. The body cameras would back up every word. The senator tried to interrupt, but the lieutenant held up his hand. Years of experience showed in his face as he assessed the scene. Camera crews were still arriving, the crowd had doubled in size, and social media was probably already exploding with video clips. "Senator," the lieutenant said carefully, "these officers are following proper procedure. I strongly suggest you cooperate." The senator's face fell as he realized the lieutenant wasn't going to simply make this go away. More sirens approached, this time the department's public affairs team arriving. They would need to handle the press, which had grown to include all major local stations and even a national news crew. This had officially become much bigger than a simple traffic stop. Officer Lee took a deep breath and made his decision. "Sir, please step out of the vehicle now. We need to conduct a field sobriety test." His voice carried the quiet authority of someone who knew they were doing the right thing, regardless of consequences. The security detail driver had his head in his hands now, probably seeing his own career flash before his eyes. He should have never let the senator get into the car in this condition, but who says no to one of the most powerful people in Washington? The senator finally stood up, swaying slightly as he got out of the SUV. The cameras caught everything. His unsteady movements, the way he had to hold onto the car door for balance, the obvious signs that validated the officer's suspicions. Officer Wilson moved to support the senator's other side, not wanting him to fall and hurt himself. Despite everything, they were still there to protect and serve, even those who threatened their careers moments earlier. The lieutenant nodded slightly at both officers, a quiet show of support for handling an impossible situation by the book. He knew, as they did, that tomorrow's headlines would either celebrate or crucify them. There would be no middle ground. As Officer Lee began explaining the field sobriety test procedure, he felt an odd sense of calm. Whatever happened next, whatever pressure came down from above, whatever consequences followed, he knew they were doing their job exactly as they'd sworn to do it. The tension in the air could be cut with a knife as Officer Lee began explaining the sobriety test. Rain continued to fall, creating a soft backdrop to the drama unfolding on the street. The senator stood unsteadily, his expensive suit already getting soaked, his previous arrogance replaced by something that looked like fear. "Walk in a straight line, heel to toe," Officer Lee instructed, pointing to a white parking space line on the wet pavement. The news cameras zoomed in closer, their bright lights creating an almost theatrical spotlight. The senator looked at the line as if it were a tightrope stretched across the Grand Canyon. Suddenly, a black town car pulled up, and a man in a crisp suit stepped out, clutching a leather briefcase. "I'm the senator's attorney," he announced, walking briskly toward the scene. "My client won't be performing any tests tonight." The lawyer's arrival seemed to reignite some of the senator's earlier defiance. Officer Wilson exchanged glances with his partner. They'd been trained for this too. Lawyers showing up mid-stop was becoming more common these days. The lieutenant stood nearby, watching carefully but letting the officers handle the situation. "Your client has the right to refuse," Officer Lee said calmly, "but that refusal will be noted, and there will be consequences." He could see the lawyer whispering something to the senator, who was now gripping the SUV's door handle to stay upright. The crowd had grown even larger, despite the rain and late hour. People were live streaming the entire thing, and comments were flooding in from across the country. The public affairs team was struggling to keep the press at a reasonable distance while trying to manage the narrative. "This is harassment," the senator suddenly shouted, his voice cracking. "I'm being targeted because of my political positions." The outburst was caught perfectly by every camera present, including his slight stumble backward that Officer Wilson had to catch. The lawyer winced visibly at his client's outburst. He tried to quiet the senator, but it was too late. The damage was done. Social media was already exploding with clips of the senator's unsteady movements and slurred speech. Back at the SUV, the security detail driver had finally stepped out, looking defeated. He started talking quietly to the lieutenant, probably explaining how they'd ended up in this situation. His career might be over, but at least he was choosing to do the right thing now. "Sir," Officer Lee tried again, his patience evident in his voice, "you have two options. You can take the field sobriety test, or we can proceed with an arrest based on probable cause and my observed behavior." The words were clear, professional, giving the senator one last chance to cooperate. The attorney pulled the senator aside for a hushed conversation. The rain had plastered the senator's silver hair to his forehead, making him look suddenly older and more vulnerable. The mighty politician who had threatened their careers just minutes ago was crumbling before their eyes. More police vehicles arrived, including the chief of police himself. He surveyed the scene, noting the news vans, the crowds, the body cameras, and most importantly, his officers following procedure exactly as they should. The senator's phone kept ringing, probably other politicians or staff members seeing the live coverage and trying to manage the crisis. But it was too late for damage control. This had become more than just a traffic stop. It was turning into a moment that would be discussed in police academies for years to come. Officer Wilson noticed something change in the senator's expression. It was subtle, but years of dealing with people in crisis had taught him to recognize the moment when someone finally accepts their situation. The senator's shoulders slumped slightly, and his next words came out barely above a whisper. "I'd like to cooperate now," he said, though whether it was out of genuine remorse or a desperate attempt to salvage what was left of his reputation, no one could tell. The senator's attempt at the sobriety test became the moment that would be replayed on news channels for weeks to come. Under the harsh glare of camera lights and the steady fall of rain, he struggled to maintain his balance on the simple straight line. His expensive leather shoes slipped slightly on the wet pavement, but everyone could see it wasn't just the weather causing his unsteady movements. Officer Lee stood nearby, calling out instructions in a clear, professional voice. "Arms at your sides, walk heel to toe, 9 steps forward." The body camera captured everything: the senator's wobbling steps, his muttered complaints, and most importantly, the officer's completely professional behavior throughout the ordeal. The attorney had stopped trying to intervene, instead standing under an umbrella with a grim expression. He knew, as everyone present did, that this was going viral in real time. People who had been sleeping minutes ago were now wide awake, sharing clips of one of the most powerful men in Washington failing to walk in a straight line. Halfway through the test, the senator stumbled badly. Officer Wilson moved quickly to prevent him from falling, catching him by the arm. This subtle act of basic human decency, protecting someone who had threatened their careers earlier, didn't go unnoticed by the watching crowd. "I don't feel well," the senator mumbled, his previous arrogance completely gone. The transformation was striking, from threatening their jobs to looking like a lost elderly man in the rain. Officer Lee felt a mix of emotions: sympathy for the human being in front of him, yet determination to uphold the law equally for everyone. The police chief had moved closer now, watching everything unfold. His presence added another layer of pressure, but also provided silent support for his officers doing their job by the book. The public affairs team was already drafting a statement, knowing this would be the lead story on morning news shows across the country. Someone in the crowd shouted, "Nobody's above the law." The cheer that followed seemed to startle the senator, who nearly lost his balance again. The world he was used to, one of private dining rooms and deferential treatment, had disappeared, replaced by the harsh reality of public accountability. The breathalyzer test came next. Officer Lee explained the procedure clearly, aware that every word was being recorded from multiple angles. The senator's lawyer stepped forward to object one last time, but his client waved him off. The fight had gone out of him completely. Just get it over with," the senator said quietly. His hands shook as he took the breathalyzer, and when the numbers appeared on the display, Officer Lee's suspicions were confirmed. The reading was well above the legal limit. The mood shifted among the spectators. Some showed satisfaction at seeing justice being served equally, while others seemed almost sad watching a powerful figure's public fall from grace. The rain continued steadily, as if trying to wash away the whole scene. Officer Wilson began reading the senator his rights, his voice steady and clear. The words everyone knows from TV shows felt different now, more real, as they were being read to someone who had helped write laws for decades. The irony wasn't lost on anyone present. The security detail driver had finished giving his statement to the lieutenant, explaining how the evening had started at a private fundraiser, then moved to a series of bars. He described trying to convince the senator to let him call a car service, only to be ordered to drive or lose his job. As Officer Lee prepared to escort the senator to the patrol car, something unexpected happened. The senator turned to him and spoke so quietly that only they could hear. "I'm sorry. I should have known better." The words seemed genuine, perhaps the first honest thing he'd said all night. The moment would be discussed later in the precinct, debated in the media, and analyzed by political pundits. But for now, it was just two police officers doing their job, upholding their oath to treat everyone equally under the law, regardless of power or position. The drive to the police station felt longer than usual. Officer Lee sat behind the wheel, his partner beside him, and their high-profile passenger in the back. The senator had fallen silent, staring out the window as the city lights blurred past through the rain-streaked glass. Inside the station, phones were already ringing nonstop. News of the arrest had spread like wildfire. The desk surgeon, a 30-year veteran who thought he'd seen everything, shook his head in disbelief as they walked in. The booking area had never seen someone of this stature before. A small army of officials had arrived ahead of them, department lawyers, senior officers, and representatives from internal affairs. Everyone knew this case would be scrutinized from every angle. The officers would have to document everything perfectly, leaving no room for questions about their conduct. "I need to make some calls," the senator said quietly as they began the booking process. His hands trembled slightly as he emptied his pockets. A gold watch, an expensive wallet, and 3 phones. The contrast between his usual power and his current situation was striking. Officer Wilson handled the paperwork while Lee supervised the booking photos. The senator's previously perfect hair was still wet from the rain, his expensive suit wrinkled. These weren't the kind of photos that would end up on campaign posters. "You got visitors," the desk surgeon announced. Both officers looked up to see the police chief and the district attorney walking in. This case was already moving up the chain of command faster than any they'd seen before. The senator's lawyer arrived moments later, looking harried and clutching a stack of papers. He went straight into damage control mode, trying to negotiate terms for a quiet release. But the chief stood firm. This would be handled exactly like any other DUI arrest. Meanwhile, outside the station, a media circus was forming. News vans lined the street, reporters standing in the rain, providing live updates to viewers across the country. Social media was exploding with clips from the traffic stop, most focusing on the moment the senator stumbled during the sobriety test. Back inside, Officer Lee was finishing his detailed report. Every word had to be perfect. He knew this document would be read by hundreds of people, maybe even used in law school classes someday. His partner double-checked everything, both officers knowing their careers might depend on this paperwork. The senator sat in a holding cell, his head in his hands. Through the glass, they could see him occasionally looking up at the ceiling, perhaps wondering how he'd explain this to his constituents, his family, his colleagues. The mighty had fallen, not by some grand conspiracy, but by a simple traffic stop and 2 officers doing their job. Pressure was already mounting from above. Phone calls from high places were pouring in. Other senators, governors, even a call from someone claiming to represent the White House. But the chief continued to back his officers, telling everyone the same thing. "We're following standard procedure." The district attorney reviewed the body camera footage on a laptop, nodding approvingly at the officer's professional conduct. "This is textbook," she said. "You did everything exactly right." Those words felt like a shield against the storm they knew was coming. Officer Wilson watched as the senator's staff arrived, looking worried and tired. They huddled with the lawyer, probably already planning how to spin this story. But the video evidence was clear. There would be no explaining away what happened tonight. As their shift finally neared its end, both officers felt the weight of what they'd done. They hadn't just arrested a drunk driver. They'd shown that the law truly applied to everyone. Their actions would be debated on news shows, discussed in police academies, and remembered as a moment when two ordinary cops stood up to power simply by doing their jobs right. The sun was starting to rise as they finished their paperwork, casting a new light on a night that would change their lives forever. Neither officer had set out to make history that night. They'd just set out to protect and serve, as they'd sworn to do. The following days felt like a whirlwind. Every major news network ran the story on repeat. The body camera footage, the failed sobriety test, the arrest of one of the nation's most powerful senators. Officer Lee and Wilson found themselves at the center of a national conversation about equality under the law. Their phones wouldn't stop ringing with interview requests. Reporters camped outside the precinct, hoping to catch a glimpse of the officers who dared to uphold the law regardless of status. The chief had assigned a media relations team to handle the constant press inquiries, shielding his officers from the circus while they continued their regular duties. Walking into roll call became different. Other officers would fall silent, then break into respectful nods or pats on the back. They'd become symbols of something bigger than themselves. A reminder that the badge meant serving justice equally, no matter who sat in the car they pulled over. The senator's office released a carefully worded statement, announcing he would take a leave of absence to address personal matters. The media dug deeper, uncovering a pattern of similar behavior that had been covered up over the years. Previous officers had looked the other way, choosing career preservation over duty. Support poured in from unexpected places. Letters arrived at the precinct from across the country, many from other police officers sharing similar stories of being pressured to let powerful people off the hook. Some wrote about regrets of giving in to that pressure, while others shared their own stories of standing firm. A week after the arrest, the officers were called to the chief's office. They found not just the chief, but the mayor and several high-ranking officials waiting for them. The room fell silent as they entered, and for a moment, both officers feared the worst. "Your actions," the chief began, "have started something important." He slid a newspaper across his desk. The headline announced new legislation being introduced to prevent political interference in law enforcement. Their traffic stop had sparked a national debate about accountability. The security detail driver had come forward with his story, describing years of covering for the senator's behavior. His testimony painted a picture of a system where power meant immunity, where badges bent before influence. But that system had cracked the night two officers chose differently. Not everyone supported them. Some politicians called it a setup, claiming the officers had targeted the senator for political reasons. Online trolls dug through their personal lives, looking for dirt. But their clean records and the clear body camera footage told the real story, just two cops doing their job. The district attorney's office moved forward with the case despite intense pressure to drop it. The breathalyzer results were clear, the evidence solid. The senator's legal team tried to suppress the body camera footage, but the judge ruled it admissible. The truth would have its day in court. Officer Lee found his rookie partner standing alone one evening, staring at the wall of fallen officers in the precinct. "Having second thoughts?" he asked. Wilson shook his head. "Just thinking about what that badge really means," he replied. "About all the officers who died doing the right thing, not the easy thing." The media attention began to fade, but the impact of their actions grew. Police departments across the country started using their body camera footage in training sessions. Law schools included the case in their ethics classes. It became a teaching moment about the real meaning of equal justice under the law. Late one night, As they patrolled their usual route, a call came in about another drunk driver. Without hesitation, they responded, treating it like any other call. Because that's what had made the senator's case special. Not that they'd arrested someone powerful, but that they treated him exactly the same as anyone else. The street where they'd made the stop became a minor tourist attraction. People would take selfies at the spot where a senator had stumbled through his sobriety test. But for the officers, it was just another stretch of road on their beat, a place where they'd done their job, nothing more and nothing less. 6 months after that rainy night, the senator's case finally reached its conclusion. The courtroom was packed with reporters, politicians, and ordinary citizens who had followed the story from the beginning. Officer Lee and Wilson sat in their dress uniforms, ready to testify if needed. The senator, looking older and more humble than the man they'd stopped that night, stood before the judge. His expensive suit couldn't hide how this ordeal had changed him. When he spoke, his voice carried none of the authority it once had when commanding congressional hearings. "Guilty, Your Honor," he said quietly. The words echoed through the silent courtroom. He accepted a plea deal, a fair one, the same kind offered to any first-time offender. No special treatment, no political favors, just justice being served equally. Outside the courthouse, cameras flashed as the two officers faced a wall of reporters. They kept their statements simple and professional, the same way they'd handled everything since that night. "We just did our job," Officer Lee said. "That's all any officer should do." The police department had changed too. New policies were put in place, specifically addressing how to handle stops involving powerful figures. The training manual now included a section using their body camera footage, teaching future officers that integrity matters more than influence. Their lieutenant had framed the original citation, hanging it in the precinct's main hallway. Below it, he placed a simple quote, "The badge doesn't bend." Young officers would often stop to look at it, understanding that those 4 words carried the weight of their entire profession's honor. The security detail driver had found a new career, speaking at police academies about moral courage and the cost of staying silent. He'd lost his job, but found his voice, turning his experience into lessons for others about choosing right over easy. One evening, as the officers patrolled their usual route, they stopped at the same spot where it had all happened. The rain was falling again, just like that night. A young rookie officer on her first week had asked to ride along with them, hoping to learn from the officers who become legends in the department. "What made you do it?" she asked quietly from the back seat. "Weren't you scared of what might happen to your careers?" Officer Wilson looked at his partner, remembering their own fears that night. But Lee just smiled and pointed to his badge. "This isn't just a piece of metal," he explained. "It's a promise we make to everyone, rich or poor, powerful or ordinary. The moment we start breaking that promise, we break everything this badge stands for." The senator had announced his retirement, using his final speech to talk about humility and accountability. He'd started speaking at schools about making better choices, turning his mistake into a lesson for others. Sometimes, the biggest impact comes from admitting when we're wrong. Their story became part of police training nationwide. Not because they'd done anything extraordinary, but because they'd done the ordinary thing when it would have been easier not to. Sometimes, the greatest acts of courage are just doing your job when everyone expects you not to. 1 year to the day after the stop, the department held a ceremony. Not to give them medals or promotions, but to honor something bigger, the idea that the law treats everyone the same. The chief's speech was brief but powerful. These officers didn't just enforce the law that night. They proved the law works. As they left the ceremony, walking back to their patrol car, Officer Lee noticed his partner looking thoughtful. "Penny for your thoughts?" he asked. Wilson adjusted his badge, making sure it sat straight on his chest. "Just thinking," he replied. "Some prices are too high to pay, and some are too high not to." They drove off into the night, ready for another shift. Because that's what real heroes do. They keep showing up, keep doing what's right, not for glory or recognition, but because that's the promise they made when they first pinned on that badge.